This is Chthonia, the world of the dark feminine. Hello, this is Breach Burke. Before we get into this week's podcast, I would like to thank my patrons personally. Gwyn K., Politi, Caitlin N., John H., Tanya T., Veronica S., Gabby, Helen M., Ruth S., Sunny H., Scott K., JRM, Susie G., Eldritch Priest, B. Lupita, C. Roberts, Jeanette, and DS. I really appreciate those of you who have joined recently and who have stuck with me over these years. Our community is small, and there's so much I would like to do in terms of providing courses, conversation on the dark feminine, and extra content, so please consider joining at patreon.com/Chthonia. Now on to the podcast. Hello and welcome to Chthonia, podcast dealing with the dark feminine. I'm your host, Breach Burke, and welcome to 2024. This is the first podcast I am doing for the year 2024. And as I had mentioned on Patreon and in a couple of other places, I think as well, this year I have my complete list of topics that I plan to cover. And one of the things that was requested by one of my patrons was that I look at some of the female mystics of the Catholic Church. So I thought, there's definitely a dark side to female mysticism. Almost by necessity, that sort of dark feminine element comes into it. Maybe not in the way that people might think of or expect, because we have certain ideas about what sainthood is and what it means, and what it also means to be a doctor of the church, because many of these women, the women that I'm going to be covering in this series, are all considered to be doctors of the church. At least 3 out of the 4, I think, have that designation. And which means that they have made some significant contribution to Catholic theology. Of course, there were no female doctors of the church before 1970, and the person I'm talking about today is actually one of those, and that would be Saint Teresa of Avila. Now, she is the founder of an order called the Discalced, or really shoeless, Carmelites, and she had been a nun in a regular Carmelite order that had followed rules that were more Augustinian. Monasteries tend to go more by either Augustinian or Benedictine kind of rules of order and practice, and their lives are basically dictated by that rule. But the order, like Saint Teresa, like Saint Francis, for instance, the orders that they founded were definitely orders that went back more to basic ideas about poverty, in particular, which I think is going to be an interesting theme here. And so I think that the core things that we're going to end up talking about, probably not only with Teresa of Avila, but we're going to start with her, because she's the one who I'm familiar with all of the mystics that I'm going to be talking about, but she's the one I'm probably the most familiar with. And what I want to do is I want to start with a little bit of her biography, okay, and talking about her and in this idea of sainthood and how that sort of connects or doesn't with what's in her biography, about her particular mystical experience, which was called the transverberation, and we'll talk about what that is and what that means. Then I want to talk a little bit about the Catholic Church and its relationship to mysticism in particular, and as well as the context of other branches of Christianity as well, and how they tend to regard mysticism, and also the attitude of the church towards poverty, because I think her mystical experience and her impulse towards poverty are both things that are actually seen as threatening. Okay? She has an energy to her that is definitely threatening. And then I'm probably going to end by talking a little bit about her work, The Interior Castle. This happens to be the work that I have. I have read her work called The Way of Perfection, but The Interior Castle I have read a number of times. It's been a few years since I've read it, so I had to pull my copy out again and take a look at it. And in fact, the initial biographical material, rather than go somewhere on the internet, I think I prefer the biographical material that introduces this book. So this is the copy of The Interior Castle. It's translated by Mirabai Starr, or Mirabai, I'm not sure if I'm saying her name right. In any case, this was one that came out in 2003 from Penguin. So this is the particular translation that I'm looking at, of this work, because it would have been initially written in Spanish. Spanish or Latin, actually. That's a good question. I'm not sure what the original language was. I'd have to look that up, because a lot of times people in the church did write in Latin, in spite of what their native language was. But this, so we're going to talk a little bit about the interior castle as well, and in particular, just one particular aspect that she refers to in her chapter on the fourth dwelling, which is one that I can compare to other aspects of the dark feminine. So stay tuned for that at the end. Okay, so let's begin with Teresa's biography. So just reading a little bit here from this particular translation, it says, "It's now common knowledge that Teresa of Jesus," which is what she was referred to, born Teresa de Ahumada y Cepeda, I'm not sure if I'm saying that right, in 1515, came from a family with hidden Jewish roots. Recoiling from the Inquisition of 15th century Spain, Teresa's wealthy Jewish grandfather, Juan Sanchez, purchased the status of hidalgo, a titled gentleman, to buy his children access to the noble classes so they could marry well. But this was only after Juan Sanchez had discovered that he and his family were under suspicion by the Inquisition for secretly practicing Judaism in their home. Many conversas, which are Jewish converts to Christianity, were actually crypto-Jews who publicly professed strict adherence to Christian dogma and privately went right ahead practicing their ancestral faith. Yeah, you have to think about the time period here in the early 1500s. You've got a couple of things going on. You have this, you have these... this persecution of Jews and this sort of forcing Jews to adopt Christianity and to convert to Christianity. Now, Spain, this was actually in Toledo, okay? And Toledo is a place that's actually quite well known for, certainly known in esoteric communities. There's a very strong esoteric undercurrent to activities associated with Toledo. And so, and the Jewish community may or may not have been part of that, but certainly the Toledo was a big target of the Inquisition. And in this case, what happened is that Sanchez decided which they talk about here, he decides he's just going to confess to secretly practicing Judaism. Whether or not he actually was, I don't know. But so instead, him and his family were humiliated. They were taken outside and marched through the streets of Toledo for 7 Fridays in a row, forced to wear costumes of bright yellow emblazoned with flaming cross and snakes. Denouncing the Sabbath of their people, they were required to kneel in every church, chapel, and shrine in the city. The job of the townspeople was to throw stones and spit and hurl verbal abuses at them. Yeah, so this is, it's just, it's somewhat unbelievable now, although I don't feel that that's a side of human behavior when there is this kind of dogmatic fear of what's outside. And again, if you look at Christianity in the broader context, Judaism's really not, they're different, obviously, but they're not outside of it. In fact, one grew out of the other. But this sort of unique problem that we have with monotheism, that each branch of monotheism, even though they're all interconnected, all feel they have an exclusive truth claim. So, and yeah, this is what the Catholic Church did when it had political power in the 1500s. So, anyway, it's okay. So it says Teresa's father, Alonso Sanchez de Cepeda, so this was her grandfather who went through this, was the youngest son of Juan Sanchez. Stung by this early experience of public mortification, Alonso focused on cultivating a life of status and prestige for himself and his own family. At the end of his life, through the inspiration of his gifted daughter Teresa, Alonso's own passionate love for God was enkindled. Okay, this is what she says. It says, early in his first marriage, Alonso's first young wife, Catalina, died suddenly, leaving him with 2 small children. He married her 14-year-old cousin, Beatriz de Avila de Ahumada, who bore him 9 more children before dying in childbirth by the age of 30. Teresa was 12 when she lost her mother, and she was devastated by her death. Beatriz had been unusually close to her children. She used to read to them under the apple trees from the chivalrous romance novels popular at the time. So at this point, it says Teresa decides that the Virgin Mary is now going to be her mother figure. Okay, so we see our first archetypal feminine figure taking over. And it says, but first, says Teresa spent some time out of control. It appears that she took advantage of what must have been an overwhelming domestic predicament for poor Alonso. Teresa adored her father, but she was a wild child. She swept up various siblings and neighboring cousins on her adventures. Harmless enough when Teresa and her companions were children off to the borderlands to challenge the Moors, these exploits grew more serious once they reached adolescence. When she was 16, it was discovered that Teresa's liaison with a certain boy, to whom she happened to be distantly related, had grown more intimate than was socially acceptable. It's not clear what exactly unfolded between the beautiful and vivacious Teresa and her smitten cousin. While the late Victoria Lincoln calls Teresa's virginity into question in her biography entitled Teresa, a Woman, her sin may have been as simple as sitting in the garden with a boy unchaperoned. It says, Teresa herself refers obliquely to the mischievous behavior of her youth, chuckling when she is ludicrously accused of certain sexual indiscretions in her 60s, while the actual crimes of her girlhood managed to fade into obscurity. Regardless of the precise degree to which this forbidden romance had progressed, the consequence was classic. Teresa was banished to a nunnery. And by the way, my understanding is that nunnery, at least in the English sense of the word, does not necessarily mean a convent. Convent, actually, in Shakespeare, for instance, a nunnery is actually the opposite. It's a brothel. But anyway, the hope was that the convent education would not only straighten out the wayward girl, but remove her from the sphere of temptation and allow the neighborhood to shift to fresh topics of interest. Yeah. And it's kind of interesting because that's something people still do now. They'll send people to private schools, children to private schools, because they think they're going to receive some kind of strict moral upbringing or discipline or education. And so, yeah, I mean, that's a practice that still goes on today, not only in Catholic schools, but in military academies. So, yeah, this sort of thing still goes on. To her own amazement, the high-spirited Teresa actually began to find herself developing a taste for the life of quiet prayer to which she had been exiled. She started to search her soul to see if she was genuinely destined for a monastic vocation, and she asked the nuns to pray for guidance on her behalf. After a process of rigorous self-inquiry, she arrived at the answer. It had to be better than marriage. This was not a simple solution. There were 1,000 things about the Augustinian convent Teresa abhorred, and she was in a Carmelite convent, by the way, not the Discalced Carmelites, which is an order that she founded with John of the Cross, but this was the standard Carmelites, not the shoeless ones. Besides, all the other nuns seemed to be so much more deeply moved by God than she was. In choir, one or another smitten girl would regularly weep at the feet of the Lord, while Teresa couldn't squeeze out a single holy tear. But the truth was she feared for her soul. Teresa knew her own nature. She was determined not to ever again compromise her father's honor with her own indiscreet romantic entanglements. Okay, so this is something we want to stop and look at. There's definitely, and this is very common experience for people who are raised Catholic. You go through this period of being, you end up confronting this spiritual question, and the response to it, because Catholicism is actually one of the branches of Christianity that would actually lead to the possibility of, to me, it's the more mystical branch. Okay, it's the one where one might have this particular experience of God. I think it's possible within Catholicism, whereas I do not that it's impossible within Protestantism, but not as likely. Certainly not within the confines of that. Certainly Catholicism and what we think of as Christian Orthodoxy, like the Russian Orthodox Church or the Greek Orthodox Church, they all belong to traditions that are what we call liturgical. So they are focused centrally on the rite of Eucharist. So this is this idea of changing the bread and wine into the body and blood of Christ. This is this central ritual, and it's the focus, and it's the taking of communion that actually allows you to open up to this mystical experience. Now, the problem here is that the Catholic Church, so it's the central and the most important ritual of the Catholic Mass. It is also the one that the Catholic Church, for whatever reason, doesn't want regular people to experience. Okay, they want you to take communion if you're a Catholic, yes, but there's all kinds of rules surrounding who can take it and who can't, because they're trying to maintain the so-called sanctity of it. Although my feeling has always been, well, if you're trying to open up people's hearts to something by having them take the Eucharist, then why would you deny people who probably need that? So that's just my opinion, and obviously, I'm not here to be a Catholic theologian, but that's kind of the way I've always felt about it. So you've got this very liturgical focus, whereas Protestant religions are more scripture focused. They are focused on the Bible itself. The Bible is like a fetish object in Protestantism. This is entirely my editorialization here, but that's the way I look at it, because scripture is primary. tradition is not primary. But these liturgical practices, having a priesthood that are the enforcers of doctrine, this was one of the things Martin Luther in the Reformation had railed against. And truthfully, Luther, who, by the way, also had very interesting psychological life, I think he had a diagnosis. I can't remember if his diagnosis was manic depression or if he was considered to be on the schizoid scale, but I think I remember from graduate school being told that Martin Luther actually was... when looking at his life in retrospect and his biography and his writings, I think it was determined that they found that some of his religious experience may have been connected to manic depression. As we will find with Teresa of Avila here, hers have been connected to temporal lobe epilepsy, but we will get there. So, okay, but you have this girl, so it's not uncommon to be raised in this religious environment where one is made to be afraid of hell, okay, since we're speaking of the underworld here. And so there's the social context here. She is a girl who is expected to be obedient and behave in a certain fashion. She's lost her mother, okay, at a young age. And it's not uncommon for girls at that age to, again, it sounded like she was a wild child, but you pretty much could see that kind of a direction or outcome. I've seen evidence of this within, my own ancestors and my family. When there's been a very young death of a mother, particularly my grandmother, who only died when my mother was 9. And so my mother I think her sister was more, a little bit more of the wild child, though she became very, very staunchly, religious to a point that, well, anyway, yeah, that I was not, even as somebody who has always had kind of a spiritual, mystical bent myself, I was just kind of like, yeah, okay. But my mother, her response had been when she was 9, because again, she went to a Catholic school, and for her, in her case, sort of the nuns were the ones who sort of looked after her. Now, I don't know if that's the same thing with Teresa here, but my mother initially did want to enter a convent. It's just that her father didn't allow it. He just said no, basically. So my mother ended up meeting and marrying my father, and, that's the way things went. But there tends to be this strong bent towards... I think the circumstances here definitely show this, and even her wildness and her rebelliousness and her strong sexual energy that she seems to have, it's understandable why that potentially could lead her in this direction, the mystical direction, because mysticism is really, it's a direct experience of the God. If you're talking about paganism, then you're talking about rites that allow you perhaps for possession by the spirit or the daemon. In Dionysus rituals, this is the drinking of wine to become possessed with the spirit of the god. In Christianity, this mystical experience, which is described by many Christian mystics, is connected to this divine union or divine ecstasy, where you have union with the divine, which this one manifests as a kind of a dissolution. Okay, so this dissolution is about, people who know Kabbalah, and we think about the tree of life. And the fact that the tree of life starts at the limitless light, which is a kind of unmanifest state. And the tree of life, as you move through the different Sephirot down towards Malkut, which is the kingdom or the earth, the place where we are here, it's the way in which the divine manifests through incarnation, okay? And you have to remember, too, there was a whole lot of discussion around incarnation. There were heresies connected to it, which people often... associate with the Cathars. Again, if we go back to my conversation with Dan Hanley on the Gnosticism, which I did as one of my Chthonia conversations, he disputes to a certain degree that this was entirely, that the Cathars, as they have been understood over time, is really a correct assessment of them. But nonetheless, there was certainly an idea, which was considered heretical, that the flesh was just evil. Literally, you shouldn't reproduce, you shouldn't do anything, being in a body at all was just the devilish, and you needed to get out of it. So there becomes this whole idea of anything related to the flesh, pleasures of the flesh, of the earth, was just considered to be flat out evil and had to divest yourself of that in favor of an entirely spiritual life, which often led to asceticism, mortification, things like that, which we will also see in Teresa's case. This is a way that people see to, in Platonic terms, because remember I've mentioned before Plato talking about the body as a tomb, soma et sema, that's his play on words there, that the body is actually a tomb for the spirit, and now it's in a prison. So it very much falls in line with this Platonic line of thinking that says that the spirit is somehow trapped in this fleshly earth tomb of sorts. And that, of course, the idea of a tomb gives us references to death. And, of course, for them, death, there's always that fear of hell and eternal punishment, which is part of that doctrine. Okay, so Teresa, we see here, she thinks she may have a religious devotion. She enjoys things about contemplative prayer. At the moment, that time, she's not going in any kind of divine ecstasies or anything like that, but she is worried about going to hell. So, okay, moving on. To her dismay, Teresa's father did not agree to her plan. His temporary solution to his daughter's troubling behavior had backfired. Why couldn't she just cheerfully wait out the stir of gossip in the safety of the cloister, and then come home and find a decent husband like other girls? Witnessing the death of her beloved mother as a result of unrelenting childbirth may well have served at least a partial deterrent against choosing the path of family. Yeah, unrelenting childbirth, yeah, that's the other thing. But Teresa's calling to a spiritual life was probably higher than that. Okay, her decision to renounce the world coincided with a rapid plunge in her physical health. Okay, so here's where the body gets involved. She began suffering from fainting spells and inexplicable fevers. On more than one occasion, she was forced to take a leave of absence from the convent and return to her father's house to recuperate. It was during one of these interludes that Teresa encountered teachings on silent prayer in the books that her uncle Pedro had her read aloud to him. Her attraction to a contemplative life deepened, and she finally convinced her father to support her decision to take vows. This profession, however, did not eradicate Teresa's troubles in one holy stroke. Her body continued to take her on a wild ride of undiagnosed attacks. At one point, she even suffered a fit of paralysis from which it took many months to fully recover. Teresa spent her entire life battling a throbbing head, inflamed joints, and rocketing temperatures. But the dangers for Teresa weren't only unfolding on a physical level. The worldly temptations she was so eager to leave behind followed her to the monastery. Visitors were invited to the convent parlor on weekends to discuss the condition of their souls with the nuns. Teresa was the natural star of this show. A skilled conversationalist and inveterate flirt, she managed to compel everyone around her to vie for a piece of her attention, especially men. Before she realized that she herself was becoming a victim of her own dubious gifts of seduction, the beautiful young nun once again grew perilously intimate with a man. She caught herself just in time to save her reputation and her mortal soul, well, according to that doctrine anyway, something she reckoned had changed. Okay, so let's stop again. So we see Teresa of Avila as somebody with a really strongly seductive sexual bent. Okay, now if we look at sex and its uses, we've talked certainly about Lilith energy, succubus energy, things like that throughout different podcasts, but also about the ideas of Tantra and the ways in which sexual energy can be rechanneled or sublimated or reused in a certain way to achieve spiritual results rather than just simply for the sake of sexual pleasure or whatever. Not for its own sake, but using the energy, the sexual energy, as a means of broadening your spiritual perspective, being able to have that experience that is not just simply about this mundane experience. Having this experience that I guess people would call it enlightenment, but it's really an awakening to the reality of things as they are, rather than what the mind seems to think that they are. It's an experience that gets you outside of and beyond the mind, and connects you to something that is more real, but it's that kind of reality that cannot be touched by the mind. Okay, that's where mysticism can ultimately take you. And mysticism has little use for dogma or doctrine. Okay, when you see the writings of mystics, including this one, The Interior Castle, even though it is written in this language, which I'm going to talk about in a bit, that sounds very self-effacing and very holy and so forth. That's just because of the people reading it. I mean, obviously her confessors and her superiors in the convent are going to be reading her writings. So if she says anything that strikes, the Inquisition as funny, she could be in a lot of trouble. So she does have to toe a certain line with what she says. Never mind that mystical experience is something that is incredibly, incredibly difficult to write about, because it is an experience that is beyond language. And I did talk about this on one of my Patreon-only podcasts when we talk about the numinous and the encounters of the numinous. So the mystical experience is something, that's why they often talk about it as being a negative theology, because it's the theology of what it is not. Like, you can literally only say what it's not, right? You can't say what it is. You can only say what it isn't. And what it isn't is something tangible that you can put your hands on. It's just something either you're going to experience it or not. And what we see here with Teresa, now obviously she's made this decision to go into the convent, but she's having all of these illnesses. It's like her body is, it's almost like her body's on fire. It's like it's burning itself up in some fashion through this decision that she makes. And it's taking her to the brink of death and back quite regularly, and putting her in a lot of pain all of the time, which is a condition that you can get in, whether you're in that condition mentally or physically. That's why I always say what doesn't kill you makes you stronger, right? It's this state of mind that you get into that allows you to deal with day-to-day life and the sufferings and pains and the changes of life, because you're almost like thrown around and thrown to the ground by them. And eventually, if you are doing that enough or long enough, it ceases to become an issue for you. You're able to manage them with some kind of equilibrium or equanimity. You're not completely thrown off by the uncertainties of life. And I've often said that religion is really a means of negotiating the unknown. So this is a way of, you're kind of being thrown around, but at the same time, in the end of it, you have this place in your head where it's the person who's like, they've seen it all. The first time somebody sees or experiences something, they get scared and they freak out, or they get upset, or they're stressed out. And then after the next few times, you're like, yeah, okay, whatever. You get to that point where you just have a strength of experience, okay? There's also a connection here, I feel, to the whole idea of dissolution. Because if I use my tree of life analogy again, there's that movement from the top of the tree, or the bottom, depending on how you look at it, and into the field of incarnation, into the field of, being in a body, being conscious, living a life, living an ordinary life, to dissolving and trying to reunite again with that which doesn't have a body, okay, which is getting outside of the body. So this is part of this process of dissolution, which manifests, this is the way you will see it manifesting in Catholic mysticism. It does manifest differently in other places, which I will also talk about. So, as Teresa dedicated herself to the cultivation of interior silence and began to grow in wisdom, her soul unfolding and flowering, her health continued to decline. At one point, she slipped into a coma and was about to be pronounced dead when she suddenly pried open her eyes beneath the wax that had already been pressed upon her lids in preparation for burial. Her recovery was deemed miraculous, and the passion of her devotion to her God deepened. Still, Teresa's path was not yet marked by the religious fireworks and divinely altered states of consciousness for which she was to become famous. In fact, though she was diligent in her spiritual practice, her inner life was rather ordinary for the next 2 decades. Then suddenly, in near her 40th year, God states started to descend like a monsoon on the parched landscape of Teresa's soul. Well, there's a metaphor for you. It began with an ordinary day in which the unsuspecting nun was strolling into the oratory. A statue of Christ, known as the Ecce Homo, look at the man, which someone had placed in the corridor, caught her eye. The next thing she knew, she was prostrate on the floor sobbing. The image of the suffering Redeemer unlocked decades of remorse and longing. The flow of tears seemed to serve as a purifying stream, washing away all of her pent-up agitation. When she at last rose to her feet again, she felt refreshed, renewed, and even reborn. From then on, Teresa experienced a relentless series of supernatural states. Visions of the resurrected Christ, his blessed mother, and various saints were punctuated by spiritual voices in which specific messages were transmitted, such as, "Now I want you to speak not with men, but with angels." Teresa understood what this meant. She plunged into a life of unceasing prayer with all the zeal of a convert. Her raptures were frequent and famous. Sometimes she entered into trance-like states that paralyzed her for hours, and she seemed to stop breathing. When these things happened in public, Teresa found them terribly embarrassing. Legend tells it that as Teresa was in the choir singing among her sisters, one day she began to levitate. When the other nuns started to whisper and point, Teresa lowered her gaze and realized that she had risen several inches above the stone floor. "Put me down," she demanded of God, and he did. Once when the Christ child appeared to her and asked her who she was, she said, "I'm Teresa of Jesus. Who are you?" He said, "I'm Jesus of Teresa." Perhaps the most influential of Teresa's mystical moments was memorialized in marble by the Italian sculptor Gian Lorenzo Bernini. And I'm actually going to have this statue featured in the YouTube version of this. That will be one of the images will definitely be of this statue. It's very famous, called St. Teresa in Ecstasy. In this unabashedly sensual image, we see the nun swooning blissfully while a clearly delighted androgynous angel plunges a flaming sword into her, leaving her on fire with the love for God. This experience has come to be known as the transverberation, and it occurred repeatedly over a sustained period of Teresa's life. Each time the blade was withdrawn, Teresa felt as if her very entrails were being pulled out with it. The pain is so severe, Teresa writes in her autobiography, it makes me moan. The sweetness of this intense pain is so extreme, there's no wanting it to end, and the soul isn't satisfied with anything less than God. And wow, there's a very confusing love ecstatic image for you. And definitely, even the statue itself it seems very, very strongly sexual. But this is like an erotic love that is divine. Okay, so this is another component of the mystical experience. There's this longing for union of the divine. In fact, there's I'm going to switch over to Aleister Crowley for a minute. I'm reminded of one of his works. I think it's Liber Lapis Lazuli, I think it's called, where he says, "O God, how I love thee, with the vehement appetite of a beast, I pursue thee through the universe." It's kind of that energy. There's this, she's just completely besotted here, and in the way that when two people are in love with each other, romantically in love with each other, the kinds of strong sexual energy that occurs between people. So this mysticism can bring about this kind of religious ecstasy, this kind of, while it's not, they'll of course shy away from the idea of carnal sexual relationships with a person. This is almost like a sexual relationship with God. I mean, let's not sugarcoat it. I mean, there is that element to it, even though it is not what we would think of as a physical relationship in the physical body, which of course is being treated like something, it's like her body is just burning up and disappearing, and she's kind of falling into this union with the divine that, again, this is plunging this sword into her heart, which is both, and it is very much a characterization of love. There's this love that is, because love can be very, very painful, and it can absolutely rip your heart apart, and it can also at the same time be dazzlingly ecstatic. Now, I'm not saying this to say, oh, this is really just some sublimation of a sexual attraction, or that's not what I mean. But that experience is, it's intense. It's an extremely intense experience, and this is certainly a way of talking about it. But it's a way of, again, words don't really describe the experience, but it's just like she's being kind of plunged into this divine love, like over and over again, whatever that is. She's definitely encountering something on a level where she is looking to dissolve and unite with it, really. As word began to spread about Teresa's extraordinary experiences, the eyes of the Inquisition turned toward the middle-aged nun. But Teresa's scrutiny of her own states was at least as severe as theirs. Fruitlessly, Teresa spent years seeking wise counsel to help her determine once and for all whether her visions, locutions, and raptures came from God or from the devil, or maybe even from mental pathology, all expressions of which at that time were lumped under the single heading of melancholy. Interesting, right? Teresa seemed to find her spiritual gifts more humbling than exalting. While she praised God continuously for blessing a common woman with such glorious tastes of his love, she remained equally devoted to the sanctity of the ordinary. Provisions were often scarce in convent life, and Teresa enjoyed cooking and eating. God, Teresa would say, lives also among the pots and pans. Once, by being politely questioned about the obvious pleasure she took in food, Teresa was said to have commented, "When praying, pray. When eating partridge, eat partridge," and returned with gusto to her meal. "God save me from pious nuns" was a prayer Teresa was heard to mumble frequently under her breath. By the time she met John of the Cross, who was another great mystic who wrote Dark Night of the Soul, one of the few men she ever seemed to recognize as being worthy of guiding her soul, she was learning to balance the inner life with the outer to keep her ecstatic impulses in check when it was time to tend to the business of religious reform. Frustrated by her observations of the lazy slide of an order founded originally on the ideas of simplicity and silence, Teresa took it upon herself to spearhead a return to the path of poverty and contemplative prayer in the Carmelite community. Okay, so this is a whole thing about how she meets John of the Cross and the kind of ambiguous relationship that the two of them had as well. Although I don't think, it's described here, Starr describes it as two hot-headed lovers. The aging celibate nun, Teresa, and the celibate young priest, John, had a passionate and tumultuous connection. Many years into their relationship, John, a natural renunciate, came to the conclusion that he was overly attached to Teresa, so he systematically burned a treasury of letters documenting their friendship. Teresa both revered John's penetrating insight and resented his unapologetic critique of her dramatic spiritual episodes. Still, John's questions were among the few Teresa ever seemed to seriously ponder, while Teresa's vision of a contemplative path became the mission of the rest of his life. So she founds this order of the Discalced Carmelites. It says, this dedication resulted in his capture by the mainstream Carmelites only 3 days after Teresa finished writing The Interior Castle, which is where I'm reading this from. The angry monks imprisoned their brother in a dark tower and tortured him for 9 months. Okay, so this is what happens to John of the Cross. On the verge of death, John miraculously escaped captivity, finding sanctuary in one of Teresa's Discalced convents, where he composed his mystical masterpiece, The Dark Night of the Soul. Okay. Yeah, and so this brings me to the next point here, and that has to do with the politics of convents, okay? But also a difficulty that when it comes to those who have very, very deep and intense mystical experiences, they generally want to, this is the path they've chosen where they turn away from what we'll think of as the external life towards the internal one, and they don't like to see these distractions around them. Now, while Teresa of Avila was obviously she enjoyed her food, and so she does enjoy sensual pleasure in that sense, she doesn't like this kind of false piety that's kind of couched in this idea of, I mustn't ever enjoy anything. See, because there always seems to be an awareness of her of the enjoyment of life and the enjoyment of these kinds of things, while at the same time there's a yearning for something for her that's deeper than that. Enjoying the outer world while at the same time also longing for that spiritual union. Okay, that is there. So it's interesting that the fact that she founded this order. Okay, I think it was very shortly before she died. I think that's, what does it say in this thing? Okay. Against the fervently expressed wishes of John of the Cross, who feared for his mentor's well-being, Teresa made the last journey of her life at the end of 1582. On her way to found a convent in the north, Teresa was sidetracked by a message from a duchess demanding the presence of the saintly nun at the impending birth of her first grandchild. It was a harrowing trip. Harsh weather and brutal conditions battered Teresa so badly, by the time she reached her destination, she excused herself and went right to bed. And she never got up again, and then she dies, and then supposedly the legend is that a white dove, interesting, I mean, I realize that's a Holy Spirit symbol, but also an Ishtar symbol. A white dove lifted into flight from under the saint's covers, a tree whose leaves had all dropped burst suddenly into blossom as if it were April and not October. A mortally ill nun was instantaneously cured, and a radiant light streamed into the death chamber while the perfume of lilies filled the air. So those are all going to be part of the narrative that would lead her towards canonization. Okay, and sainthood, because that's the idea that one of the things about sainthood is that when a saint dies, you may have these kind of miraculous, you're always going to have miracles. They have to have 3 miracles, I think, to be canonized a saint. And also this idea of the body being incorrupted, because even though apparently like her hand was removed, like different parts of her body were removed after death, it seems that the body itself remained intact and uncorrupted, which is what they consider to be one of the signs of sainthood. And sainthood being really just a state of not having any sin. Although, as we can see, the definition of sin within Christianity generally, and within Catholicism in particular, Teresa is, so you're not that she didn't live a life free from sin. It's that she, whatever she went through, she paid for her sins and now was saintly. So she wasn't, according to Catholic doctrine, she wasn't going to hell, she wasn't going to go to purgatory, she was going to go straight to heaven. So that's the idea, if we think about it from that doctrinal standpoint. One of the other trips that she made, because they're talking about her ill health, this line, she says, on a particularly grueling trip, Teresa and her nuns were attempting to cross a raging river with their donkey cart when a cable broke and washed away their supplies. Exasperated, Teresa withdrew to meditate under a tree. There she heard the voice of God reassuring her that this hardship was a sign of his loving friendship. Well, no wonder you have so few friends then, Teresa grumbled in reply. So she wasn't, there wasn't, in spite of the text, she definitely didn't have this personality of somebody who, she seems like she had a certain amount of sarcasm, a certain amount of wit. I mean, certainly she knew how to defend herself politically. In certain situations, she was very glib, so she has this gift of gab. She knows how to communicate. And, her spiritual experiences, when they were public, she was actually embarrassed by them. So this wasn't something that she enjoyed showing to people. And as I had mentioned, there have been discussions of her as potentially having temporal lobe epilepsy, which, by the way, if you ever study parapsychological studies and things, or if you go back through the old, I remember for a paper I wrote, I went through the old annals of the Parapsychology Foundation, which weirdly the library I worked at had. I don't know why we had them. We had them up through like 79 or something like that. They basically, they talk about, there's a lot of episodes, particularly poltergeist episodes, that are talked about in terms of temporal lobe epilepsy and the way in which, the weird way in which the energetics of that event, which happens in the temporal lobes and in the kind of on the sides of your head, in front of your brain, that these somehow can discharge a kind of energy that, in the cases of some of these people who were very, very in certain oppressive circumstances, were able to cause things to happen around the room, and could be that that's a similar energy within the body of Teresa. I mean, whatever the spiritual component of it may or may not have been, that might have also been part of what she was suffering from in terms of seizures and things like that. So, nonetheless, we see that the Inquisition still looks into her because, a woman having a spiritual experience like this is extraordinarily dangerous, and they're not going to hold her up as a saint until they can be absolutely sure that her energy has all been sublimated in the way that they consider to be proper. Nonetheless, she was canonized in 1622 by Pope Gregory XV and was named a Doctor of the Church by Pope Paul VI in 1970. So Teresa of Avila she had a very interesting life, and as a saint, it's the saintly life. Typically, saints are, they're not always, but in a lot of times they are women who have lived in convents. They always seem to be clergy. And the ones who are regarded as mystics are the ones who have removed themselves from the world and removed themselves from the normal flow of what you would think of as marriage and children and family and all of that kind of stuff. So that leads me to a couple of different points here. I've mentioned the way that she's channeling her sexual energy here into this kind of experience, and which seems very, very potent, again, from a tantric viewpoint. But at the same time, you see that she's not entirely disconnected from Earth. She has a distaste for the pious. She's not enjoying sex, but she certainly is enjoying eating, which is one of the pleasures that we all, women especially, like, you can't enjoy that. You have to live on salad and water and just avoid everything else in the name of being healthy. But she enjoyed her food, and she enjoyed. She wanted to enjoy life, and apparently she was very friendly with other people as well. So it's not that she was, even though she founded an order that was removed from the world, she wasn't entirely removed. Also, though, what was interesting about Teresa, she wanted to found an order that was not only based on contemplation, but also on poverty. And this is an interesting pattern that you will see in the Catholic Church when you have very, very pious individuals who later become saints. As I mentioned, Francis of Assisi earlier, he's another example of this. They go and they found orders that are very poor, where you just have a small community that is dedicated to contemplation and the kinds of spiritual practices that would lead to this kind of internal spiritual contemplation, like this mystical contemplation that leads them to sainthood. And you would think, that the church would encourage that. No, it doesn't. It does not. Because as I've said before in other places, poverty is an extraordinarily threatening thing. None of the orders that you see, we always talk about looking at priests and nuns and so forth and saying, look at them, they live in these nice houses and they have all these things. Yes, they do. They do. The Catholic Church has a lot of money, and even though the priest or nun or whatever themselves may have like only a very small salary, they're living in a community. Maybe they all share, like nowadays they would share like one car or something like that. A lot of times they live very well, especially parish priests and things like that will oftentimes, they're not rich people, but they're certainly not living a life of poverty and lack. But because Benedictine orders, the Augustinian orders, even if this idea of simplicity and poverty, you always talk about these vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience, which the nuns usually take. Poverty, from my experience of nuns, poverty has never been the thing. In fact, a lot of times, certainly in my mother's case, I think one of the things that was attractive was that the nuns just seemed to have a nice life. And her family at that time had been very poor. So it was like, ooh, that's attractive. The convents that I have been in and out of, not in convent to to stay. But, when I was in Catholic school, when I've been in the convents, there was a period of time when I was going through something. I'll talk about that at the end. But I did actually go to Catholic retreat houses and places like that. Ones where I had found nuns who I felt were not so dogma driven, but perhaps were more experience driven themselves. And I would spend a lot of time there, not only because they would usually, weekends of like long silence and things like that. And also I was able to kind of raid the convent library for things that I was interested in reading about. So it was, there's definitely the idea of poverty. If you go back to what I have said about Tantra in other podcasts, one of the things that's threatening about Tantra is that it upends the social order. One thing that was threatening about Bacchic and Dionysian worship was the idea that it was the leaders of that were the poor. And also I've mentioned that people who get involved in certain aspects of Tantra or certain aspects, of Santa Muerte worship and things like that, or even certain of the Caribbean, Haitian or Caribbean religions, the Afro-Caribbean ones, you have... There seems to be this element of overcoming oppression. And one type of oppression is poverty. When you are poor and when you don't have any money, you don't have privilege. Now Teresa comes from a family that is privileged, but it's tenuous because they have their Jewish roots, which was very, very dangerous at that point in time. And so the idea of anything where one engaged in poverty was very suspicious to the church. They were not going to allow that for their own renunciates, because that state of poverty or desperation, potentially there's a connection, at least psychologically, I should say, there's a connection between poverty and this kind of subversion. Okay, that it's subversive, and it is a state that makes people very, very uncomfortable. I mean, yes, you have all these religious groups who are dedicated to trying to help alleviate poverty in people, but the idea of opting for a state of poverty is considered to be subversive. My own guru will often say, in order to understand the poor, you have to live like the poor. And people are very, very suspicious of that, because they don't understand this idea of completely turning away from an external life for an internal one. That's just not something. The church wants to pick and choose who's going to do that, and they want to oversee that process. Mysticism is not, it's okay within certain approved contexts to try to deepen that relationship. But if you are a type of person who has those kinds of experiences, as I was when I was younger, I'm not going to say like Teresa of Avila's experiences, but I did have very, very deeply contemplative experiences that where I remember the priest saying to me, "Oh, those things don't happen to people like you." I said, "Oh, really? They don't." So yes, they do. And when you have those kinds of profound experiences, they change you, and they change you in a way that makes you go outside of the fence. Because mysticism, I remember when I took a course on mysticism as an undergraduate, the professor saying to us, she said, if you put all the mystics together of all the different world religions, let's just say you had Islamic mystics, and you had Christian mystics, and you had Hindu mystics, and you had, whatever. When you put them together, they all have an understanding of something that has nothing to do with the doctrines. You're not going to have them sitting there quibbling over theology. You're beyond that. And that's something that the institution does not like. They don't want you to be beyond the theology. They want you to be subject to the theology. And weirdly, this is something that comes out of Gnosticism. I remember in early Christian church, Irenaeus, one of his critiques of any particular sects that were regarded, what would be regarded today as Gnostic, and again, as that conversation with Dan, he had pointed out, Gnostic is not, it's an umbrella term that's used, but not all Gnosticism is one vanilla type. They're all different. But nonetheless, one of the critiques of Gnosticism that Irenaeus had made was that, Christianity should be for everybody. And they talk about, certain people are ready for gnosis and for that knowledge, and other people are not. However, this is exactly what the clergy does. They say, certain people are open to that gnosis, and other people, oh no, you're just a regular person, and don't you go down that path. You just follow the rules and do what we say, and maybe you won't go to hell, and you'll be fine. All right? So this leads me into the last piece that I want to talk about here. As I've mentioned, The Interior Castle, which is this particular work, I like I said, I have read The Way of Perfection, but I tend to prefer this book by far, where she talks about 7 dwellings within the interior castle. Some people try to line that up to the chakra system of Hinduism, but I don't know. I don't know that we necessarily need to make those kinds of distinctions. But Teresa uses the metaphor of a silkworm that turns into a white butterfly, like as the journey of the soul, that you undergo one state, and then eventually that state dies, and then is cocooned, and then there's this moment of transformation in which one becomes this butterfly that flies free. So, and it's probably one of the best metaphors for that transformation or that metamorphosis that is not scary. It's a death that is that death that literally transforms you into something else. Certainly these winged creatures have been emblematic of the soul. Words for soul do come from usually birds or other, they're I assume to be winged kind of creatures. Even way back in Egyptian and archaic times, the soul is seen as having wings. The Babylonians saw it that way. The psyche or the psyche is also seen as being winged in some way. The word anima, is related to the wind or to flying in the wind in the air. So there's this definite sense of the soul as something flying free, but we often think of that as the soul flying free of the body. This is more the soul flying free of its social limitations, the soul flying free of the confines of what's convention, which probably is the greater prison than the physical body. I mean, our physical bodies are limited, yes, but I think it's not so much about that. It's about the way in which both our rationalistic and the social rules kind of bind us into this fortress or this place that we cannot escape. And one of the ways certainly that I think women would have escaped at that time would have been to go into these contemplative orders. And because you can't escape outwardly, you escape inwardly. There was one bit here and I have it opened up here, where she is talking about the fourth dwelling. Now, according to her, the fourth dwelling is about as far as most people can get, because it's the one space you can be in where you can live a mundane life, an everyday ordinary life, and still have this experience that she calls the prayer of quiet. So I just want to read you what she says about it. And, the language is going to be a bit flowery, but, remember who the audience she's writing for here. She says, "It seems to me I was talking about consolations in prayer and how they are sometimes entwined with our passions. This can trigger fits of sobbing. I have heard some people say that they experience a sense of constriction in their chests and even uncontrollable movements in their limbs." Of course, that she was talking about herself. "These experiences can be so powerful that they cause nosebleeds and other painful effects. Since I haven't been through anything like this myself," no, of course you haven't, "I can't say much about it. I'm sure these kinds of things must be very consoling because they're all about loving God and basking in his presence." She says, "What I call spiritual sweetness is a very different thing. Those of you who have experienced this will know what I mean. In other books, I have referred to this state as the prayer of quiet. See if this image helps you understand what I mean. There are 2 fountains, and they each have a basin to be filled with water." She says, I haven't found any better metaphor for describing certain spiritual experiences than water. I love this element. I have spent a great deal of time contemplating it. These 2 basins fill up in different ways. The water from one comes from far away, carried through many aqueducts, requiring much ingenuity. The source of water for the other one is right beside it, and the basin fills soundlessly. The spring is abundant, and so the basin spills over and a large stream flows from it. This requires no engineering skills or the construction of conduits. The water just continually bubbles forth. I think that's a great metaphor. Okay, the one that just flows naturally as opposed to the one that's engineered. I think that the water that comes through the aqueducts is like spiritual consolations in meditation. We draw these consolations through our thoughts. We meditate on created forms to help us, and we fatigue our minds. Yes, because what you're dealing with here is beyond the created form, and we get attached to the created form. But anyway, finally, through our own efforts, comforting feelings come splashing in, making noises as they fill up the basin. With the other fountain, the water springs directly from its own source, which she's calling God. When His Majesty wishes to bless us with supernatural favor, the delight brings with it the greatest peace, quietude, and sweetness to our innermost selves. I don't know where it comes from or how it comes. Earthly consolations are felt in the heart. This kind is not, at least not at first. Later, once the spiritual delight has filled every vessel in the soul, overflowing into all the faculties in each of the dwellings, it reaches the body. That's why I say it starts in God and ends in ourselves. And also, when I use the tree of life metaphor, the idea of vessels being overflowing with things is not going to be lost on some of you. Anyone who's experienced this knows that ultimately our whole outer selves definitely come to enjoy these sweet pleasures. As I write this, I'm thinking again of that verse I mentioned, dilatasti cor meum, which says that the heart is expanded. Yes. Okay. Yeah. The heart is expanded. Yes. That's the way. Yeah. I'm just gonna, okay. She's right about that. Let's keep going. But I still don't think this is an experience of the heart. Yeah, it's not an experience of the heart, but that's where it's felt. I think its source is much deeper inside. I think it must come from the very core of our being. I have seen secret things in the soul that have left me dumbfounded. And how many more than these must there be? She talks about in the vastness of God, our little minds can know nothing at all. This is not to say what we do see of you is not extraordinarily wonderful, or that your works are anything less than magnificent. She's referring to God. But she's saying that, the mind cannot know anything of this experience, and she's right. And so she says, the soul herself cannot even understand what is unfolding here. She senses a certain fragrance, we could say, as if within the depths of her being there were burning coals sprinkled with sweet perfume. We cannot see the light or locate the source of the fire, but the sweet-smelling warmth permeates the whole of the soul and maybe even spreads into the body. And she says, look, try to understand what I'm saying. We don't actually feel heat or smell an aroma. The experience is far more delicate than that. Even if you have not gone through these things yourself, you must know that they really do happen. The soul perceives and understands this more clearly than my mere words could ever express. No matter how intensely we may crave spiritual delight, we cannot acquire it through our own efforts. It's not forged of the same metal we are, but is made from the purest gold of divine wisdom. I don't think faculties are unified here, but they are absorbed, gazing amazed at what they can behold. Yeah, that's her way of trying to describe this experience. And I'm just going to say one last thing about this, because I feel like I am probably taking a very long time with this episode. But this thing, I remember when I first read about the prayer of quiet, I went, yeah, okay, I know exactly what she's talking about there. Because it is a profound quiet. One of the first experiences I ever had, but of course mine was not, I've experienced this in two different ways. So I want to mention this as sort of a wrapping up thing. I don't always bring my experience into this, but I think this is one place where I can. So around the time I was separated from my husband, getting divorced, I had gotten more and more involved. This is when I first met my guru. This is when I was first initiated into Hinduism. This is the first time that also I started going to convents more often. Now, mind you, I'm doing a thing that, if Catholic priests find out I'm doing this, they're like, you're not allowed to do this, but I did it anyway, is I would go for Eucharist. Because one of the things I had contemplated at that time, because one of the things Amma would always say, was she would say, well, people are often do best in the religion that they were born in. So I had to explore that possibility. I later rejected it because I said, no, Catholicism is not my path. I'm not going down that path again. But I would go for Eucharist, and there was one really curious thing would happen. Once I had started Kali worship, okay, and once I had started engaging in regular Kali puja and Kali meditations, and also once my guru had initiated me with mantra, and I started doing that kind of practice regularly, that's the first time I started having experiences just like what she's talking about. And one version of it is it's almost like you're in this center place. Prayer of quiet's a good way to describe it, because you're like right in the middle of like this silence, while all the noise of everything is just kind of out there and around you, but it's just there. Like, you're not part of it. It's just there. I don't know how else to explain it. And the fact that it's there is, well, I don't know. Our adjectives are when people say, and it's good, or it is, it's just there. It's not, there's no judgment about it, I guess. There's no moral judgment about its rightness or wrongness. It's just there. And literally the first time I had an experience, the metaphor that I also had to do with water. The one that I had come across dealt with was the idea of throwing, the way that you can throw pebbles into a pond and watch it kind of ripple outward. And again, all these metaphors, they're just metaphors. They're not really telling you anything. Like, she's talking about the sweetness or the aroma, and she's like, yeah, but there's no smell, there's no fire. It's just I'm trying to describe to you what this is like. And I can tell you that when I would take Eucharist after very intensive times of Kali Puja, I found that almost an identical experience happened, but it starts in the heart center. It's literally like the whole heart just like opens up like a door, and it's just like there's just this flow. It's like this unbelievable flow that just occurs. And I can't describe it to you, but it literally puts you in that same state of stillness. Okay, there's a stillness to it that you're in. And when you're in that state, it's like that's where the mind is unperturbed. That's why you're not thinking about 20 million different things. Your mind is just quiet and you're peaceful. I mean, you might feel happy, you might not. There's definitely like a blissful feeling to it, but it's just a very profoundly quiet feeling. And certainly when you encounter other people, your disposition towards other people will tend to be, if we generally put up a lot of boundaries, or if we're very angry people, or if we're very I don't know, just people who are closed off, there tends to be more of a feeling of compassion towards people when this state occurs, because you're realizing everybody, it's almost like you're recognizing the sacredness in everything around you. I can't explain, because that's not the thought that comes into your head, but that's almost just how you feel. Even if somebody was in your face, like yelling at you or insulting you or whatever, you're just kind of like, okay, it's just, and then it's not like a, yeah, man, okay. Like, it's not like that, but you just somehow, I don't know. It's just, it's irrelevant, because the judgments and the external social, they don't mean anything anymore. You're just kind of in this space, and you're in this, at this point of reality where you realize all of this other stuff is just kind of a drama, and it just is what it is. And that's the way that I had seen it. But I found that I could have a similar experience through Eucharist as I did with doing the pujas and doing the meditations. And they're both probably different ways of arriving at that experience. I don't, one is not necessarily privileged above the other, and both of them, due to a certain extent, have their own confines and rules that are associated with them, at least if you were going to practice them in a very traditional way. But when you go into the space on your own, and you don't look to have formal clergy or, guide you. That's, I think, the one problem I have with Catholicism. I don't need to have obedience to kind of like a male authority to tell me how to guide this experience, which, even though it's being couched as this relationship between lovers, and it kind of is, I don't know. I feel that it's just very, very deeply connecting with the reality of what is, which again, this is speaking in Hindu terms. They would say it's an illusion. It's illusory in nature. It's real, but there's an aspect. But what we think of as real, what we perceive as real, is not real. The reality of it is something at the core. There's something there. What's apparent? Oh, I guess I shouldn't say that it's not real. I want to amend that. It's not. It's just that what you see is not all there is, and there's something of a much deeper dimension behind it, and some kind of a unity behind it as well. But it's not anything you're ever going to be able to dissect and analyze, because it's a unity, so it can't be. It's not the type of thing that can be dissected. Or if you do dissect it, you're really not. It's not, the whole is not the sum of its parts. It's something different. So anyway, I don't want to go waxing on about this, but I can tell you that the first time I ever read that, I was just like, yeah, I see, I know exactly the kind of thing she's trying to describe here. And it's very difficult to make people understand, but it's not, to my mind, limited to one particular religious expression. For her, this happened to her. She was doing this within the context of Christianity. I feel like Teresa of Avila could have been somebody who could have, maybe in today's world, she would have gone down a more esoteric path. I don't know. But she was definitely somebody who, who went internally. And as you can see with the church, that's going to mean either that you become a saint or that you are just condemned. There's like no in between there. There's it depends on whether or not, on how well you've convinced the authorities of the authenticity of your experience. And that isn't necessarily anything to do with the intelligence, experience, or piety of the priests, because sometimes it is political. If you have a man-hating priest, a woman-hating priest, I should say, then it doesn't matter. Everything you do is going to be suspicious and of the devil, because they're going to be projecting their own negative relationship with the dark feminine on you. But I feel like with Teresa, it's weird how she's managed to kind of internalize all of those elements. Even though she's talking about the Virgin Mary and she's striving for all these things, I feel like she's connecting. She still, I think, feel like somebody who's very, very connected to the earth. She was very connected to sensual experience. But it's almost like they're talking about her as a mystic. I almost see her as almost a Christian Tantric. It's like she's somehow sublimated all of that energy into this divine relationship that later led to, apparently, and maybe ironically, maybe not, but it's like her with some of the other mystics, that becomes doctrinal theology, like something that significantly contributes to the theology of the church. So, yeah, I've always said Catholicism does well when you talk about Campbell's 4 functions of myth, which I also apply to religion. I always feel that the church does well at the first function, which, if you're willing to immerse yourself in it, it can take you to that kind of mystical place. As long as you're willing to let go of a lot of the dogma along the way, because you will inevitably, regardless of the religion. Where I feel it falls down is socially. For the most part, like most Christian religions, I feel like socially is where they have the potential to excel, but I think that's where they most frequently fall down, because of the attempt to keep up these walls and boundaries And I think they lose a lot of people because people who have these authentic experiences, they try to say, oh, no, you need to stay away from that. You just need to go live a regular life and not deal with this. But people are confronted with it. Even regular people are confronted with it. And that's the whole point. You don't need to be somebody away in a monastery somewhere. You can experience this in your day-to-day life, and it should profoundly change your life. If you're completely unconscious of it and you keep it away and just mindlessly follow the rules, then you're never really, then you're not, as far as I'm concerned, you're not really living it. You're just kind of an obedient little, you're just being like kind of just being led around, and you're not really, there's really potentially no transformation going on. Or if there is, you're just not really having an awareness of what the impact is, or how it's happening to you. So anyway, I think I'll stop talking about that now. I want to thank you so much for listening. Please check out my website, Chthonia.net, for all of my material. If you would like to join my Patreon, and I'd like to thank my patrons again. I always thank them at the beginning of the episode, but you can feel free to join me at patreon.com/Chthonia, where I do extra podcasts, and we'll be doing, providing other kind of behind the scenes material, plus early access to episodes and swag and things like that. And I'm on social media as Chthonia Podcast, one word on X and Instagram, primarily on Instagram, and 2 words on Facebook. And it's just Chthonia on YouTube, although now, like I said, now it comes up as at Chthonia Podcast, one word as well. Thank you so much for listening, and we'll see you in the next episode.